The projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 16, Days of Episodic Excitement, in which Jim Reid and today's guest join me to talk about cliffhanger serials.
Tell me, gentlemen, have you changed your decision concerning the Dalai plaque?
Why do you want the plaque?
Since we are, in a sense, brother scientists, I do not mind telling you that the Dalai plaque is one of the keys to the lost tomb of Genghis Khan.
Greater reason why we refuse to surrender it.
Then I must resort to sterner methods.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. Over the course of the prior episodes, cliffhanger serials have come up with some regularity, either specific titles or just generally referred to as a format. Today, we're going to do a deep dive from a high cliff into a topic infested with alligators, robots, masked villains, and any other sort of peril you can think of. Guiding us on our tour of a style of filmmaking that continues to have an impact on popular entertainment is Ed Hulse, who has written several books on the subject. Jim, welcome back aboard, and Ed, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, before we get into the matter at clutching hand, could you give us kind of an overview of your history as a writer and publisher?
Well, I started writing professionally in 1980. I was between jobs, and a friend had gotten a position at a company called VR Publishing, and they were published trade magazines that covered the consumer electronics industry. And they also had a consumer magazine, a newsstand magazine called Video Review.
I was a subscriber, and I have fond memories of that magazine. In fact, some of the pieces in that magazine were one of the inspirations for my creating my magazine, Television Chronicles.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, well, I got involved with them. My friend, who was a fellow film buff, knew that I was between jobs, and he said, listen, if you're looking for some extra money, this new magazine started up called Video Review. And at that time, we're talking about 1979 now, late 79, the major studios were only just beginning to get into pre-recorded video. The market at that point was dominated by suppliers of public domain product, frankly, although there were some magnetic video with licensed movies from 20th Century Fox. There were some majors out. But anyway, they said our emphasis initially is going to be on home taping. And so what we want to do is we want to get movie buffs to contribute capsule reviews of movies that frequently play on TV as a guide to people at home who might want to tape them using their brand new Betamax, or at that time VHS was just starting to get popular. Long story short, after submitting some sample copy, they gave me some work. For a long time, they used to run 500 reviews a month, and I would do anywhere between 50 and 70 of them a month. And I started contributing articles as well. And then the publishers, who also issued these trade publications for the consumer electronics industry, hired me on a freelance basis to contribute articles to magazines like Consumer Electronics Monthly, Video Business Magazine, which, as the title implies, covered really the retail aspect of the business. And they had other magazines like Audio Times, and the big one was Consumer Electronics Show Daily, which was issued at the big Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which, by the way, they still do every year, every January. So I got worked into that company, and I worked there for several years. I had editorial positions. And as a result of my contacts here, I did some freelance for some other bigger publications. I once had something in the New York Times, in the New Yorker magazine. A couple editors at the company eventually left. One of them went to Premiere magazine, so I did some movie-related articles for Premiere. And the other one edited the video section of Entertainment Weekly for Time Warner. So I periodically contributed some stuff to Entertainment Weekly. And I had a nice gig there when they would put out their annual Oscar issues every year. They would always have a retro feature, like 50 years ago at Oscar time. And they would typically hire me to do those features. So in that capacity, I got to interview people like Robert Mitchum, Liza Minnelli, and a number of other Oscar winners and Oscar nominees. So I did that. And then in 2002, I never really got the printer's ink out of my blood. I left those magazines eventually. And I started publishing a little magazine called Blood and Thunder, which was kind of a catch-all magazine for all the things in which I was interested. Basically, everything related to American popular culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Pulp magazines, movies, old-time radio drama, mystery novels, dime novels, everything along those lines. Kind of threw them all in there. And then I did other books that would spin off individual topics, including some of the serial books you referred to. So I've been doing that. My company is called Murania Press. And I started self-publishing, frankly, because I would submit outlines to major publishers. And they said, this looks really good and we like the way you write, but quite frankly, we think that the subject matter is too limited in appeal for a mainstream New York publisher. So having no other way to disseminate this material, I decided to publish it myself, which I could do in the early 21st century, thanks to the advent of desktop publishing software and Amazon-affiliated companies like CreateSpace, which had private printing of authors' books as a business model, where you could have the books published by CreateSpace and they would automatically be listed on Amazon. So that's how I got into the self-publishing racket. And I still firmly believe in the old adage among small press publishers, if you want to make a small fortune in publishing, start out with a big fortune. That's pretty much the way it goes. I now publish Blood and Thunder, which I originally started as a quarterly magazine. I publish that as a yearly annual book-sized edition, which removes me of the onerous task of soliciting copy on a quarterly deadline and gives me more time to research and write the things that I'm doing myself in the magazine.
Yeah, and the books, I'll just go down a quick list here of the serial related books that you published. Distressed Damsels and Masked Marauders, and then the follow-up to that, which is Handsome Heroes and Vicious Villains. Now, Distressed Damsels has a really nice comprehensive history of the serial format. The rest of it is really devoted to Pathé, which I guess was the dominant producer of serials during that era. And then in Handsome Heroes and Vicious Villains, the follow-up to that, you cover other studios, including Mutual, Mascot, Universal, various others. And then the other ones I'm familiar with, it's also really 2 volumes, is Blood and Thunder's Cliffhanger Classics. And I gather that's made up of articles that you had published in the magazine over a period of time. And that zeroes in on very specific serials, which including some really fun ones that I am particularly interested in. Well, I say fun ones because some of them are lost. I mean, I'm really interested in them, like Tarzan the Mighty, House Without a Key, the screen debut of Charlie Chan, and so forth. But they're still fascinating, the amount of information that you're able to get in there on those, even the lost ones. So now, speaking of the book and some of the material in there, because you really cover this in your introduction, but can you just give the listeners kind of a synopsis of how you became interested in serials?
Well, I was between 9 and 10 years old. An afternoon, I would get home from school, and there was an afternoon kiddie show on WPIX Channel 11 in New York, out of New York City. I was living in northern New Jersey, as I am now. And it was a show called Officer Joe Bolton. He was a guy that dressed up in a cop's uniform. He used to swing a nightstick around. And he would introduce Three Stooges shorts, cartoons, and then every day he would have a serial chapter. And I got hooked. And what he would do is, rather than confuse the viewers by letting the thing run to the end, where they have a chapter card saying,
"Don't miss the next exciting episode at this theater next week."
Since the kids were going to be watching this on television, he would delete that, but he would give the following episode's title as a code. You'd have the cliffhanger ending, the screen would cut to black, and then Officer Joe would come on and says, "Now, kids, tomorrow's episode is going to be B6, D12, whatever," and that would spell out the episode title. So I got hooked on those. And then there was another show on New York TV where they ran the Flash Gordon serials, which really got my attention. So I loved the format. And, I'm talking about 1962, 1963. During this time, men still wore hats and they still drove around in big clunky cars. My mother had a 56 Studebaker at the time that was not too far removed from the cars that these guys were driving in the 50s serials that I saw on Channel 11. So I could still relate. And of course, we still had black and white TVs then. I could still relate to the format. And I loved the action and the crude melodrama and the hooded villains and the whole thing. And I never really lost my fondness for them. And when I started collecting 16 millimeter film in the early 70s, this, of course, is the pre-video era. By that time, most of these things had gone off the air. And the only way you could see them was to buy 16 millimeter prints. And so serials being as long as they are, a complete serial would run 4 to 5 hours, 12 to 15 chapters. They were pretty expensive to buy. And for a long time, as a college kid, I could only afford to buy one chapter at a time. So I'd make an arrangement with the dealer and I'd buy one chapter this month and another chapter another month. And then, of course, as I got more money, I was able to buy them more frequently when I started working full time. And then, of course, I got seriously interested in terms of wanting to know more about how they were made and researching them, going to public libraries, reading up about what had been written about them in the motion picture trade papers, the various news items and papers like Variety and the Motion Picture Herald and other trade journals that covered serials as they were being made and released. And then finally, 50 years ago, almost 50 years to the day, I went to my first film fan convention, which was devoted to serials and B movies and comic strips and all that kind of overlapping stuff I was interested in. And I started meeting people because the guest stars would include some of the people who had been in these things. Not only the stars and the leading ladies, but also the stuntmen and in a few cases, the directors. So, for example, in 1973, I got to meet from the serial Adventures of Captain Marvel, which is a big favorite, one of my top favorites. I got to meet the co-director, William Whitney. I got to meet the stuntman who doubled Captain Marvel, Dave Sharp, one of the great stuntmen in Hollywood. And I got to meet the guy who played Billy Batson, the kid who said Shazam! Frank Coughlin Jr., who later became a good personal friend of mine. And who else was there? Oh, Billy Benedict, who played the sidekick Whitey and was also played Whitey in a zillion or so Dead End Kids and East Side Kids movies. So I got to meet them and I got to ask them questions. And little by little, even though I was not yet a professional journalist, my interest led me to come up with really fairly deep questions. In other words, I wasn't just interested in getting their autograph on an 8x10 still and saying, well, nice to meet you. I wanted to learn more about how these things were made. And what I found out over a period of many years, because I went to these conventions and met literally dozens of people who worked in these things, I found that if you asked the right questions, if you were sincerely interested, they would give you great answers. For example, I had a couple of very specific questions that I wanted to ask the legendary stuntman Yakima Canutt, whose career, goes into A movies and B movies. And he later became a second unit director and a stunt coordinator himself. And I asked Yak a couple of questions, and he was impressed with what I was asking him. And he gave me very comprehensive answers. So those couple questions turned into a 2-hour conversation. And like I said, even though I was not a professional journalist, I was already scribbling down feverishly these things that they were saying, figuring somehow that I would use this information later on, that I would have these quotes available long after these guys had shuffled off this mortal coil. I did that for many, many years. I went to those conventions. Like I say, met a lot of great people, got a lot of information, and that helped the research that I was doing with primary sources like the old trade journals. And I got a hold of old scripts to serials and I analyzed those to see the differences between how they were written and how they ended up on film. So it was just a hobby that became an obsession.
Well, one that a lot of us have shared and enjoyed your immersion in. Jim, what about you? I mean, do you have any serials in your vast collection?
I have one. I have the first Dick Tracy serial.
Ah, okay. Well,
that's on 16 millimeter. I've got a bunch of them on video, but I was wondering, in one of your books, you mentioned the Green Archer, the silent Green Archer, and I was just, is that extant?
Unfortunately, the short answer is it doesn't seem to be. Now, I say that because some 50 or 60 years ago, the film historian William K. Everson claimed to have seen a print in an archive in France, Cinémathèque Française, and he said it was very good. Over here, now that, by the way, that print either doesn't exist or it deteriorated or it got lost, because in the intervening years, I've tried to find out if they still have it. Apparently they don't, and it was not preserved. Now, what they did do, the UCLA Film and Television Archive acquired the collection of a kind of a legendary collector of silent movies named John Hampton, who used to run a theater in Hollywood called The Silent Movie. He had a fabulous collection, and somehow he had gotten a hold of the final 3 reels 3, 4, and 5, of an unreleased 5-reel feature version of The Green Archer, which was in 35 millimeter nitrate and multi-tinted, including green scenes whenever the Archer was on screen. I did get to see those privately at the UCLA archive. I actually saw them twice. I had a friend of mine who you probably knew too, Jim, Jerry Goulden. He helped me when I was researching my books on the silent serials. He helped me see over a period of many months every scrap of silent serial footage that the archive had, including these Green Archer features. Now, The Green Archer is based on a novel by a British thriller writer called Edgar Wallace, and I happen to be a big Edgar Wallace fan and a collector of first editions of his books. So The Green Archer was always kind of a holy grail for me. And so what happens is those final 3 reels of this unreleased feature-length version roughly cover, they have bits and pieces from the last 4 chapters of the 10-chapter serial. So I have seen those, and they did preserve 1 reel because it was starting to deteriorate, but that was already like 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. And Jerry left, and Jerry was the guy who was really interested in seeing the serial stuff preserved. The people that followed him did not have the same commitment to preserving that material. So I have no idea if those other 2 reels are still there, whether they've disintegrated or whatever. I would hope not. Then again, I do understand with preservation dollars being as hard to come by as they are, I can understand the archive not wanting to preserve an incomplete subject to which they're almost certainly never going to find the first 2 reels. Now, why Hampton didn't have the first 2 reels, that's a question nobody's ever been able to answer, but he only got reels 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah.
So, Jim, what was your earliest exposure to serials?
Well, they used to run a lot of the Republic serials on the NBC affiliate in Tulsa, where I grew up when I was a little kid, and I got kind of hooked on them there. And then I remember when the Batman craze hit in '66, they released one of the Columbia serials. I'm not really sure which one it was, but I remember going on a Saturday to a movie theater and sitting through the whole serial. It was like 3 hours or so.
In the suburbs of Gotham City is the home of Bruce Wayne, known to his neighbors as a wealthy playboy. Only the faithful Alfred knows the closely guarded secret of what lies beneath the house. The Batcave, famed headquarters of those relentless crusaders for law and order, Batman and Robin.
And then I've just always loved serials, Unfortunately, I've not collected them just because, I'm not really sure why. But I had a friend who was a collector who passed away, and part of his collection was the Dick Tracy serial, and I got that. So,
yeah. Well, my first exposure to serials, it's actually 2 parts to this, and I'm not sure which part came first, but there was a Saturday afternoon, or maybe it was a Sunday afternoon, and I also grew up in Tulsa, so it could be that Jim and I shared some of the same experience, but I think mine was a little more limited, because I just remember this one instance. I turned on the TV, and this thing was playing, and I don't think I saw the beginning of it. I don't know that I saw the end. So it could have been a feature version, or it could have been a chapter as such being run. But all I knew was it had this mysterious masked hero called the Copperhead.
Corwin just reported. A man in a copper mask jumped him and knocked him out. When he came to, the briefcase was gone and that copper snake was in his hand. A Copperhead.
And years later, I would realize that what I had seen was a portion of the Republic serial, The Mysterious Dr. Satan. Now, the chapter I saw did not happen to have the scary robot of the, what I like to call the Prince Albert model variety. But in any case, it still captured my attention and a degree of fascination. Now, the other story, the first time I really became aware of a serial as such was the Tulsa World newspaper used to sponsor in the summer. They would partner with one of the local movie chains, and several theaters they would have matinees. Yeah, right. And you clip a coupon out for take it with a quarter and get in. You'd see, I saw a couple of Tarzan movies that way, and some others. And one year when they did that, they had the serial The Iron Claw, the talkie version.
A fabulous fortune is at stake. The Iron Claw is hot on the trail. He lurks in the dark. He strikes in the back. Murder, intrigue, horror, destruction. Brother against brother, friend against friend. Who is this man who holds them all at bay? Who is this man who laughs at the law and underworld alike? Who is the Iron Claw?
I never saw the resolution. I don't know. For some reason, I didn't go see them all, because the way it worked was they would have a different movie at each theater, and they would rotate them. So if you went to the same theater each week, then you would eventually see all the movies in the series that they were running. Or you could just, go across town or wherever to see whichever one you're most interested in. And I think I tended to do more of that. But for some reason, I didn't see how the serial turned out or anything. But it also occurs to me that they must have skipped some, because how many chapters are in that? It's got to be at least 12, if not 15. I don't remember. The Iron Claw, the talkie? 15. Yeah. There were not 15 theaters participating in that, I'm pretty sure. So I figure that they had to have left some chapters out somewhere along the line. But in any case, that was my first official exposure to serials. Now, getting into the origins of serials, and this is something that I really found interesting in your book, Distressed Damsels and Masked Marauders, Ed. I assumed that there was a relationship to printed stories. I think it's like, the Sherlock Holmes stories and all that. I wasn't sure, though, if it could be traced all the way back in history, that type of storytelling, maybe all the way back to, the Oresteia, the Greek trilogy of plays. And it's been how many decades since college that I finally find a reason to refer to the Oresteia. Anyway, there were no cliffhanger endings in those, even though they had what you could call a story arc. And they weren't just literary, from what you described in your book. There are some direct literary ties to the earliest serials, but also some theatrical productions fed into those. And I was fascinated by what you described as the 10, 20, 30 melodramas.
Right.
I've given you a lot of intro there to talk about.
Well, my own research, serialized storytelling, as you say, goes way, way back, even before the origins of the printed page. But for my purposes, and of course, since we're dealing with the serial as an American devised concoction or method of storytelling, I kind of see the beginning point roughly in the mid-19th century, before the Civil War, when there were things called story papers, which, just as the name implies, were newspapers that had fiction in them, that were entirely fiction, as a matter of fact. Now, a lot of these were intended for boys, but there were family-oriented story papers as well. One of the most popular was the New York World, which was published by a company called Street and Smith, which later became very famous in pulp magazines. They kind of graduated from story papers to dime novels to nickel weeklies, and then to pulp magazines, all of which had popular fiction that was primarily melodramatic in intent and in style, not necessarily tasteless or graphic, although at the time some people thought they were, but they were very crude in their dramatic approaches, let's say. And they had very clear-cut heroes and villains and storylines, very simple, direct storylines, unlike in more contemporary literature, what we call literature today, which is character-driven. These things were always plot-driven. So the characters were really just archetypes. And they were made that way deliberately so that people would have no trouble telling who the hero was, who the villains were, and the motivations of both sides. So the story papers and the kinds of stories that they included kind of gave way to a theatrical equivalent, which you mentioned, which was known as 10-20-30 theater. And 10-20-30 referred to the admission prices. Now, we're talking about a type of theatrical presentation that was popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So in, around 1890, 1900, 1910, just before World War I, you were paying $1 or $2 for a Broadway production, what they called the legitimate theater. 10-20-30, obviously being so much less expensive, was geared towards working class people and even immigrants, especially in the big cities like New York, which was kind of the headquarters of 10-20-30. I mean, there were 10-20-30 theatrical troupes that toured the country and performed the same shows. They had a circuit of cities that they would hit year to year. They'd have a different show every year that they would tour with. But New York was kind of the hub of this kind of theater. And there were, of course, especially in the early 20th century, a lot of immigrants whose grasp of English was limited, if not non-existent. However, that didn't really matter because the 10-20-30 shows, like I said, they had very clear-cut heroes and villains. They had a very clear-cut, if kind of overly dramatic style of acting. So this is where you get the cliche of the mustache twirling villains and audiences hissing the villains and cheering the heroes. This all derives from 10-20-30. But even more importantly to their relations to movie serials, a lot of them had, especially as a closing act, as the climax of the play, some big action stunt. There were some theatrical productions of this type that simulated fires, that simulated floods. There were either some that had horse chases. They actually had live horses running on treadmills in the theaters, all of which were the last-minute rescue of the heroine by the hero. But it wasn't always just the heroine who got rescued. Probably the most famous 10-20-30 show, which I believe first played in 1890, was called Blue Jeans. And Blue Jeans had as its climax the heroine racing to save her lover, the hero, from being sawed in half. The villain had tied the hero to a log in a sawmill, and they actually had a live sawmill. And every night, the actress playing the heroine had to make sure that she hit that switch that shut off the blade before it got to the guy. Now, obviously, there were stagehands. There were fail-safes to prevent any mistakes in timing. But it really was a live rotating saw, and the log really was getting chewed up by this blade every night in this theater.
The tech rehearsals for that must have been pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah. But these thrills, these very visceral thrills, made the 10-20-30 dramas, you could say famous, you could also say notorious. But the term 10-20-30 actually got into the lexicon, especially with the variety reviewers, because later on, when reviewing in the early days of silent movies, when they were referring to crude but vigorous action motion pictures, they would often refer to them as typical 10-20-30 type melodrama, and audiences, especially the showbiz savvy readers of variety, would know exactly what they were talking about. So when the motion picture serial started, it originally started around 1912, 1913 as a vehicle for cross-promotion. And the idea was many newspapers in those years, not just story papers, by the way, but legitimate newspapers, would often run fictional stories, especially in their Sunday supplements. Most big newspapers had a special Sunday supplement where they would have various features and entertainment coverage and things like that. A lot of them would serialize stories. And the serialized story was always a boon to circulation because if you got into a story that the readers really liked, they were guaranteed to buy that paper for however many weeks that the story lasted. So somebody said, well, motion pictures are getting big now. A lot of people are going to these Nickelodeons across the country. And if we could tie the serialized story into a motion picture version of the same story, we could not only use that to promote our newspaper, but we can also make movie-going a weekly habit, because just as people wanted to buy the newspaper every week to read the next installment of the story, the idea was they would certainly want to go to their local Nickelodeon on the same day every week to see the film version of it. So typically in the early years of serials, the film version would be released on Mondays. We think a lot about serials as Saturday matinee type things, which of course they became in later years, especially as they were intended primarily for kids. But in the beginning, when serial motion pictures were considered family entertainment, the chapters would typically be run on Mondays following the print installment that you had read in the newspaper on Sunday. Now, this had the added benefit because then as now, Monday was the slowest day of the week for theaters. Monday is the day that people typically stayed in. By having a serial chapter on a Monday night, you drove traffic to the theater that otherwise would probably not have gone. And actually, the tradition of running serial chapters on slow nights in movie theaters, that persisted well into the silent era. I mean, they were doing that well into the 20s, running on a Monday or a Tuesday night as opposed to Saturday afternoon.
Well, that's interesting because, we tend to think of them as just part of the regular program. I mean, things are so uniform nowadays. I mean, or even during the time we were growing up. I mean, whatever day of the week you went, you saw the feature and whatever the cartoon was in front of it, whatever the trailers were. I mean, that was the same thing that you saw any night of the week. So that is interesting.
Actually, in those very early days, I'm talking about 1912, 13, 14, 15, the feature film had not yet become the standard mode, let's say, of cinematic storytelling. They were short subjects. And again, this went back to the idea of variety, of wanting to get people in and out of their local Nickelodeon. And there was a big emphasis on what was called the balanced program. And in these days, everything were shorts. They were one-reelers or two-reelers, or in some cases, what they called split reels, which were things that ran 3, 4, 5 minutes. The early cartoons, for example, animated cartoons, were generally split reels in those early days. But you would get a comedy, you would get a Western, you might get a newsreel. The newsreel started very early. But the idea was in any program, nightly program that was usually, let's say, 5 reels long altogether, which would have given you in projection time around 75 minutes in those early days, the serial was actually considered the feature attraction of the program, of the nightly program. Now that changed when what we now call feature-length movies of 5 reels or more, those became popular 1915, 1916, 1917, and really by the end of World War I, the feature film dominated the programs. And you started getting in those years where they used to change the program every single day. You started getting split programs. It would be 2 or 3 days. They'd have one attraction, 2 or 3 days, another. Then the weekend might be a third program. And what happened was that as storytelling became more sophisticated and the feature films told stories that had more complicated narratives and the style of acting gradually changed, the vigorous action and the crude stereotype characters of the serials made them more and more for kids. So that's why after around 1920, you start to see the serial shift more towards kiddie attractions. Now, that's not to say they still didn't draw adult audiences. Like I say, that pretty much was a feature of the entire silent era. It wasn't until the early talkie years that the serial was considered almost 100% a kiddie kind of attraction. And by the way, we were talking earlier about the cliffhanger endings. The very earliest serials didn't have cliffhanger endings. They would end a chapter with a big climactic action scene, just like the 10, 20, 30 melodrama did. But there would be a rescue within the chapter, and the hero would say, well, that was a close one. Hopefully we won't get into more trouble next week. And next week would bring another perilous situation for them to get into. But the very early serials, and this was also partially because while serials are generally thought of as being weekly attractions, the very earliest ones weren't. They were every 2 weeks. For example, Pearl White's The Perils of Pauline, which is one of these serials that has this legendary reputation for kicking off the genre, was a very popular and very highly successful serial. That was released every 2 weeks. Episodes were released every 2 weeks. And the same with The Adventures of Kathleen, 1913, which I consider the first true serial. Now, there was a serial, I call it a proto-serial, called What Happened to Mary, which was produced by the Edison Company and released in 1912. Some people consider that the first true serial. I don't. Those chapters were released monthly. There were several other series that had recurring characters but separate plot lines, and Edison also released those. He would release them once a month, and there would be a different one every week. The Edison Company in 1912 and 13 had series that were overlapping, and What Happened to Mary was one of those.
Yeah, you made that distinction in the book between proper serials and series. And as you say, being that, I guess the difference is there's no continuing story arc between them. They'll bring back the same character, but with unrelated adventures,
right, pretty much,
so to speak, and it'll be wrapped up within the framework of the episode. And those apparently, I guess maybe those were more common in other countries. You talked about the serial being considered kind of an American format because there were early Sherlock Holmes series over in other countries, Britain and Germany. There was even as late as the mid-20s, there was a Fu Manchu. There were a couple of Fu Manchu series over there, I know. And we briefly mentioned, I guess, what Republic would become regarded as in the talkie era in terms of its prominence. Pathé really was it in the silent era, it sounds like.
Yeah, Pathé, which of course the Americanized arm of Pathé was called Pathé Exchanges. It was in France known as Pathé Frères, a couple of brothers who ran the show. Over here, they were primarily a distributor originally of these various short subjects that would be put together as programs. Now, there were some organizations that would market their own weekly programs, like Universal. Universal, you would subscribe to their service. You'd pay them X number of dollars a week, and every single day you would get a different program. Carl Laemmle, who ran Universal, was probably the industry's biggest booster of what they called the balanced program. So his original serials were just part of the service that you got. They would be released typically on Tuesdays. I'm talking about Lucille Love, Girl of Mystery, The Master Key, and The Tray of Hearts. They were Universal's early serials. Then when serials became so popular, thanks to The Perils of Pauline and Tannhauser's The $1 Million Mystery, which was another phenomenal success, Carl Laemmle figured out, I'm a dummy to be including serial chapters in my regular weekly program. They make so much money, they fill the theaters, I can get more for them. So after that first year, he started breaking the serials out and selling them separately from the regular program, and he could charge more for them per chapter. But Pathé, originally they had separate production units. Louis Gasnier, who was the producer of Perils of Pauline, formed a company called Astra with several other Pathé employees, George Fitzmaurice, George B. Seitz. I forget who the other one was now. But anyway, they would produce serials for Pathé release. And then there were other independent producers who would do the same thing. The Wharton brothers, Theodore and Leopold Wharton, had their own production. They were based out of Ithaca, New York, and they had their own studios up there. They made The Exploits of Elaine and its sequels. And one of the most famous serials, in fact, the only serial to provoke an international incident, a serial that was produced with the backing of William Randolph Hearst called Patria, which was a 1917, what they used to call a preparedness serial, trying to get the United States public interested in intervening in World War I. Patria was one of these serials, and the plot, which was pretty wacky, posited that the Japanese, of all people, formed an alliance with Mexico to invade the United States over its southern border. And this was partially a response. Hearst had properties on the border that were being raided by Pancho Villa and the other so-called rebels, who were really just bandits. And he also had a beef with the Japanese. So he essentially underwrote this entire effort and hired the Whartons to make the serial. Well, the serial was so inflammatory that the Japanese ambassadors to the United States lodged a formal complaint. And President Woodrow Wilson himself wrote to Hearst and said, "My God, you're killing me with this thing. Will you consider withdrawing it?" So Hearst refused to withdraw it. He had a lot of money in it. What he did do was he pulled the prints back and changed the titles and took out any reference to Japanese and had all the villains as Mexicans. Presumably, he wasn't worried about diplomatic complaints from Mexico. So it is kind of funny because in some of these doctored prints, you have Warner Olin, who later played Charlie Chan. His character was named Baron Hiroki. He was a Japanese villain. Well, they changed his name and he became Mexican. Somehow, with the same makeup, he became a Mexican villain. But that showed how prominent serials were in the early years, that something like Patria could get the attention of the Japanese ambassadors and provoke this potential international incident that involved the intervention of the United States president himself. That just shows you how big serials were prior to 1920.
Yeah. Wow. And now, earlier we talked a little bit about the existence or non-existence, as the case may be, of the Green Archer. So kind of going in that direction, are silent serials lost at a higher percentage than silent films in general, do you think?
No, I think it's pretty much the same. I think it's 85 to 90% are lost. And I think that tracks with the percentage, certainly of feature films. And there are some that are almost complete. There are some on which only a few chapters exist. There are some on which feature-length versions, because a lot of serials were released in edited feature versions. And that was especially for theaters that did not run serials. You know, there's also a kind of a myth that serials, while they were popular, played everywhere. They didn't. During the early years, before the feature film got big, they played in maybe 50 or 60% of the Nickelodeons. But that percentage went down substantially. For most of the serial's existence, it didn't play in more than 40% of the existing theaters. So there were feature versions edited. So there are feature versions that exist. There are some serials that all exist as the coming attractions trailer.
Oh. Okay, so we've covered, not exhaustively, certainly, because there's so much that can be delved into. But in terms of now getting into the sound era, which are going to be the ones that are more readily available, that more people have seen, how did the transition to sound impact serials in terms of format, content, audience, that sort of thing?
Initially, it killed them because around 1929, as the industry was transitioning to sound, it was believed that the fast action format of the serial would not lend itself to talking pictures. Now, remember, we're talking about the days when you still had sound microphones in booths on sound stages, and there was not a lot of mobility in the camera work. That's why Pathé got out of the market pretty much. They stopped producing serials in 1929. Then, of course, shortly after that, they merged with RKO, and that's a whole separate story. But in the beginning, it was believed that it was just incompatible. Its sound movies and serials were incompatible. Henry McCrae, who was a Universal producer who went back to the very earliest days of Universal Pictures, was one of Carl Laemmle's right-hand men back in the silent days. He produced something called The Indians Are Coming in 1930, which proved that you could record outside. Now, of course, by this time, there had been a couple of big Westerns already. There had been in Old Arizona, the Cisco Kid Western with Warner Baxter, The Big Trail in 1930 with John Wayne. So they were already making strides towards outdoor recordings and, more importantly, dubbing, the sounds of hoofbeats and gunshots that would be dubbed in later. And eventually they said, okay, well, we can continue to do serials. But by this time, movies had become so sophisticated, especially in the late silent era. The storytelling aspects of them, the type of films they were making had become so sophisticated that by this time the serials were definitely relegated to kids. So that was the transition that took place in the early 30s. So Universal continued to make serials. Mascot, which was an independent company started by a guy named Nat Levine in 1926, he was still making sound serials. And there were a couple of independent producers that made one here and one there. But that was what marked the transition of the serial going primarily, not entirely, but primarily to Saturday matinees intended for kids. And this is where you had a lot of the most flamboyantly idiotic kinds of plot devices and character types, and a lot of cheating in the cliffhanger endings, that kind of thing.
Cheating? I have no idea what you mean by that.
You're kidding. You want me to explain that?
Oh, no. No, I think Kathy Bates explained it pretty well, actually.
My favorite was Rocket Man, and once it was a no-brakes chapter. The bad guys stuck him in a car on a mountain road and knocked him out and welded the doors shut and tore out the brakes and started him to his death. And he woke up and tried to steer and tried to get out, but the car went off a cliff before he could escape. And it crashed and burned, and I was so upset and excited. And the next week, you better believe I was first in line. And they always start with the end of the last week. And there was Rocket Man trying to get out. And here comes the cliff. And just before the car went off the cliff, he jumped free. And all the kids cheered. But I didn't cheer. I stood right up and started shouting, "This isn't what happened last week! Have you all got amnesia? They just cheated us! This isn't fair! He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car!"
Well, that would also account for why then as source material, so many of the ones that we think of came from comic strips, comic books, pulp magazines.
What happened was, because there were fewer theaters that were playing serials, and because they were getting dimes from kids instead of quarters from adults, they said, we got to promote these things. We got to come up with properties that we can adapt to the screen that have built-in audiences of their own. So we don't have to market these things from scratch and just hope we can get people in. So there were adaptations of Pulp Fiction, but what really kicked it off in a big way was in 1934 when Universal licensed the aviation comic strip Tailspin Tommy, which is totally forgotten today. But in those years, remember, this was not too far after Charles Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic. Amelia Earhart was in the news. A young guy named Howard Hughes was trying to break speed records with his flight. So in 1934, aviation was still pretty hot.
A flyer! Gee, a real flyer, Steve. Think of it. Someday I'm going to be a flyer, Steve. A great flyer, too.
I bet you will, Tommy.
And in those years, as my own father told me, he grew up on a farm in New York. When you heard a plane flying overhead, everybody went outside to look at it. That's how big they were. Anyway, Tailspin Tommy, which was a so-so serial, was a massive, massive success. And Universal then jumped and made a big deal with King Features Syndicate, which was the outfit that was owned by the Hearst newspapers, and licensed a whole bunch of the King Features comic strips, including Flash Gordon, which was the most famous, Radio Patrol, Ace Drummond, Red Barry, which was a Dick Tracy imitation, and several others. And from that point on, really, from the mid-30s on, most of the serials came from pulp magazines, comic strips, or kiddie-oriented radio dramas, which mostly aired in the afternoons on weekdays. Those were the three primary sources. They also had, they would have their own individual plot lines. At different points in their careers, the serial-making organizations would occasionally retrench because licensing these characters was an expensive proposition. And the more popular the character was in the media that he or she originated, the more it would cost a studio to license them. So, Dick Tracy, which Jim was talking about earlier, Republic paid 10 grand to license that in the beginning. Now, you're saying, well, 10 grand, that doesn't sound like all that much. Well, the total budget for that first, or what they call the negative cost, which means the entire cost of making the film up to the final negative from which they struck release prints. The negative cost of Dick Tracy was only around $115,000. So to spend $10,000 for the rights before you shoot a foot of film, you can understand how expensive these things were. So there were times when the studios would retrench and they'd create their own heroes. They would try to create their own masked heroes. I think the most famous example of this is in the late 40s. Republic came up with a Rocket Man character that they used in several different serials, guy with a bullet helmet and a rocket strapped to his back. They used him in 3 serials and a 12-episode series of non-connected episodes, which also wound up on TV later on. Well, that was a character that they owned, so they didn't have to pay and they didn't have to license rights for that.
Mando Cody. Yeah.
Pardon? Yeah. Well, he became Commando Cody. In the beginning, He was Jeff King.
Yeah.
And in the 3rd serial, he was Larry Martin. So they had different names for them. But yeah, the Commando Cody. And then they used the Commando Cody name for the TV.
Yeah, those were all great.
Yeah. But they were all part of the same tradition.
And inspired the Rocketeer.
Yes, they inspired the Rocketeer, right.
Well, and another thing I noticed is that a lot of the more famous silent serials were remade.
Yeah.
Loosely, for the most part, I gather, but Perils of Pauline, The Iron Claw, The Green Archer, Clutching Hand.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases they were all, I mean, the Iron Claw, the sound Iron Claw has absolutely nothing to do with the silent Iron Claw, which was a pearl white serial, which has the distinction of featuring the very first mystery hero. There were a lot of serials that had mystery villains.
Right.
Where there would be 5 or 6 different suspects who would cast shifty glances around and do suspicious things. And you had to guess which one of them would turn out to be the master villain at the end. Well, they flipped that in 1916 at the Pathé serial, The Iron Claw, where they had a hero called the Laughing Mask. And he turned out to be the secretary of Pearl White's father. But they decided if the audience is invested in trying to figure out the identity of the villain, and they're willing to come back every week for that, how much more will they be invested if it's the good guy and they're trying to figure out which of the supporting characters is the good guy? So they started that. Now, the Green Archer, interestingly, is much more complicated in that the Green Archer is shown to be working for both sides. So you're never really sure in the silent Green Archer which side he's on until close to the end of the serial. Whereas the sound version, they just had 2 different Green Archers, and you knew from the beginning that one of them was actually one of the henchmen dressed up as the Green Archer to fool the heroes.
Well, I know, and the Lone Ranger was another one where you had to guess the identity of the hero.
I have reason to believe that one of you is the Lone Ranger. Now, if the Lone Ranger will admit his identity, it will save the others from execution.
Wasn't it that way with the Masked Marvel as well? It's been quite a while since I've seen that one.
Yeah, the Masked Marvel, quite frankly, began when they had a character called the Masked Marvel. They'd already announced the serial. And by the way, in the initial advance publicity for the Masked Marvel, it appeared to be a Western. And they had an advertisement with a guy with a hood and a cape riding a horse. But then they decided to make it a wartime serial instead. And then somebody said, well, you know what? We could use the Lone Ranger gimmick. And it will be the same thing. You'll have 4 guys who look the same. One of them wears a mask. And in the end, we'll figure out which guy is the Masked Marvel. Now, the Lone Ranger, which you mentioned, a truly classic serial, one of my top favorites. That was made for negative cost was somewhere around $168,000. It grossed more than $1.2 million in film rental. Now, when I say film rental, I'll explain very quickly that the serials were rented to theaters per chapter. And you didn't gauge their profitability by how many kids came in and paid their nickels and dimes at the box office. You judged your profits by how many rentals you got and how much rentals. Now, they charged a little more for the Lone Ranger because it was based on a phenomenally popular character. But that $1.2 million made it the most profitable serial Republic ever made in its 20-year history.
Wow. And you mentioned that it's a favorite of yours. Well, that's evident because that's one of your books. It's called Behind the Mask, and it's about the making of the 2 Lone Ranger serials.
Yeah, I was very lucky there because a friend of mine was doing research on the Lone Ranger radio show for what will be a 4-book series when it's said and done. I don't know if anybody's going to buy 4 books based on one radio series. Nonetheless, he had unlimited, unrestricted access to the files of George W. Trendle, who was the guy who owned the radio station where Lone Ranger was created, and he held the rights for many years. So I got to see all their records, the contracts, the telegrams that were fired back and forth, script conferences. And so I was able, thanks to all the material I got from this guy, whose name is Martin Grams, thanks to him, I was able to put together a history with material that nobody had seen before.
All right. Well, here's a question for both of you. We'll start again with you, Ed. And that is, of the various cliffhanger serials, what would you say is the, for lack of a better term, hairiest ending to a chapter that comes to mind?
You got to describe hairy for me. But I mean,
they were all kind of hairy.
Insanely dangerous.
Oh, I think my favorite is still the ending to chapter 1 of Daredevils of the Red Circle, which has the hero riding through a tunnel linking the mainland to an island off the coast of Southern California. And the villains halfway across have used an oil drilling rig to drill into the tunnel, and they're timing the breach so that when the tunnel is opened and the governor and his party are riding through, they're going to get caught in this flood of the Pacific Ocean that will, of course, destroy this tunnel.
Here we are on the air to bring you a word picture of the opening of the $6 million Channel Tunnel, connecting sunny Santa Alicia Island to the mainland. The air is tense with excitement, ladies and gentlemen, as the tunnel is being opened in direct defiance of threats that it will be destroyed. Crowds of people are being kept back as a safeguard against any eventuality. The public knows that the elusive, malevolent 39013 has never yet failed to carry out a threat.
So the hero has found out about this. He starts from the island and he's racing through the tunnel to try and head off the governor and his party who are in the other car. And he hits the point just where the tunnel is breached. So the concluding shots of the episode are this guy on the motorcycle with this huge tidal wave cascading towards him from the background, which of course is a rear projection screen of a miniature set. They built the tunnel in miniature and flooded the miniature. And then he's perched on the motorcycle in front of and the last few frames of the shot show the wave swamping over him and the screen goes to black.
That's a really underappreciated serial, in my opinion. I mean, I hadn't really heard of it till a few years ago. And a friend of mine had a print and he was screening a lot of serials, and that was the one that went over the best.
How you can be so cruel and yet lives beyond me.
You'd best pray that I continue to live, Granville. If anything happened to me, so that I fail to come down here and refill this reservoir, the water would drip entirely away. And when the reservoir became lighter, and these lethal gas capsules would break up on the floor, the gas would kill you in a very short time, Mr. Granville. So you see, your life depends on nothing happening to me.
So are you in agreement in terms of the one that strikes you as the hairiest, most perilous?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Okay, well, mine's very similar. In fact, I had to refresh my memory because initially I was thinking that it was Daredevils of the Red Circle, but actually it's the end of chapter 1 of Spy Smasher. And if I can keep the setup straight here, the bad guys have a hideout that's in a wine cellar, and butting up to the wine cellar, there's this, what looks like a mining tunnel, and it's got tracks in it, and they use a handcart to traverse it. Well, Spy Smasher chases some of the villains into the tunnel. They're on the handcart heading for the far end of the tunnel, and Spy Smasher, once he's in the tunnel, the bad guys behind him seal off the door. So he's in a dead end of the tunnel now. Well, the guys on the handcart, the bad guys, they stop at this other exit to the tunnel, and there's this device that they set to essentially go off. And as Spy Smasher runs toward it, he realizes, okay, something bad is about to happen here as this machine starts to spew flames. And so he jumps on the handcart, heading back towards the dead end. He's got a box of hand grenades on the back of the handcart as he's heading toward a dead end with a huge wall of flame pursuing him in this tunnel. So, as I say, mine involves a tunnel too, but it's fire instead of water.
Well, you're right. They are similar in theme.
Yeah. Ed, what is your favorite cereal? Do you have one?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a really tough call for me, and people have asked me this before. I would have to say, for nostalgia purposes, the first Flash Gordon cereal, which is another one that was enormously popular and a huge moneymaker. But as a kid, I just thought it was great. I was a big fan of Flash Gordon. However, in terms of what you might call the art of the cereal, and it's very dangerous to use art and cereal in the same sentence, but let's say the craft of the cereal and the general thematic nature of it, Republic's 1940 version of Drums of Fu Manchu.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a more skillful blending of story and action than you usually get in serials. They usually all go one way or the other. And a lot of the action-oriented serials, I have to say, as much as I love them, are kind of mindless. But Drums of Fu Manchu, which was more expensive than most and took longer to film than most, mostly because of the extra time they took to light very moodily the sets, create a real atmosphere of mystery and peril.
An ingenious device. It is called the Seven Gates to Paradise. A body, let us say yours, Professor Randolph, is strapped in. The first gate is opened and some of my small, hungry friends are permitted to join my guests. I have had guests who have successfully passed 3 of the gates, but not one has ever come through the 4th.
Drums of Fu Manchu, starring Henry Brandon as Fu Manchu, I think is the best, certainly the peak of the Republic serials. And its co-director, the aforementioned Bill Whitney, agreed with me. That was his favorite of all the serials he directed.
I'll second that. That's my favorite. What about you, Jim?
I think I'm going to go with Spy Smasher.
Okay.
Sorry to have kept you waiting, gentlemen. I've delayed the privilege of removing the greatest enemy of our cause, Spy Smasher. Here there is no escape.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's the ones that are readily available. Now, in terms of what's available to see, what would you say is the best, or, it could be more than one. What would you say are the best silent serials?
You mean of the ones that are around?
Yeah, the ones that people would actually be able to see.
Boy. I would say, even though it's been worked over and edited, a group called the Serial Squadron, which is a coalition of fans, one fan mostly, they did a kind of patchwork version of a 1918 serial called The House of Hate, which is a Pearl White serial, which is really excellent. Now, most of Pearl's things are just gone, or they exist in fragmentary form. To give you an example, there are several companies that sell what they call complete restored versions, restored in air quotes, of Perils of Pauline. Well, what they actually are is they're a foreign edited 9-chapter version. When it was originally released, Perils of Pauline ran 20 episodes. So you're seeing less than half of it in these so-called restored versions. And of course, House of Hate, you're only seeing about half of that too. However, coming a few years later, the action, the stunt work is of a higher order. And there's some very good production. There were some very big sets. As a matter of fact, there's one set in that kind of a grand hall of this big estate that covered the entire stage of their Fort Lee studio. And boy, it's so tough.
Well, I like Tarzan the Tiger, although it's not fully silent. I consider it primarily silent because you just have some sound effects here and there.
And it was released in a silent version too. Yeah. So I like Tarzan the Tiger a lot, although it only makes me wish I could see Tarzan the Mighty.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
The contemporary reviewers said, well, Tarzan the Tiger is good, but it's not nearly as good as Tarzan the Mighty. So as much as I like Tarzan the Tiger, I could say, well, wow, what are we missing here, from Tarzan the Mighty? And then, there are other serials that I saw in UCLA that survive complete, but that are not available. And that's a shame. But I would have to say The House of Hate is a good one. There are several that I would say are not great, but they're representative. They deserve to be seen. There's one that's very nice that's transferred from 35 millimeter material called The Mysterious Pilot, or The Mysterious Airman, pardon me, Mysterious Airman. That's commercially available. There might be others, and then there's a bunch that have been released in fragmentary form.
Yeah. Well, to kind of bring things full circle, it seems it's kind of ironic that as the serials died out, and presumably, and I think this was actually stated in your book, with television coming along, the story arc aspect of it kind of went away with television. I mean, there were a few exceptions. I think Rocky Jones had some story arcs, things like that. So that went away in television. I mean, until, of course, we get Batman in the mid-'60s, which was directly imitating the format. And in fact, it was the Batman Columbia serials that inspired the creation of that series. But for the most part, other than 2-part, 3-part episodes of TV shows, you just really didn't get that. And then it seems like, I think when I started really noticing it, I think it was sometime in the 90s, I think of the series Alias with Jennifer Garner, where you really started getting cliffhanger endings as more and more a regular feature of a lot of these action-oriented series anyway. And now we've gotten to the point where even the format has kind of experienced a revival, because I don't know if other streaming services are doing it, but on Roku, they have what they are calling series, but they have episodes that are about 7 to 10 minutes each. So it's like watching a cliffhanger serial. One that I just watched is Most Dangerous Game, which is loosely based on the famous story, but it's that kind of format. And so I just find it fascinating that we've gone full circle now with that cliffhanger format that began back in the 19-teens.
Well, it's even more pronounced than that, because the concept of the serial, a weekly episodic show with a central plot, has now come to these series that are on cable, like Showtime and HBO. Yellowstone is a serial. Yellowstone has a different subplot every year, but each episode leads into the next. And in many cases, one episode will begin at exactly the point the last one left off. And these things are limited. There are only 10 or 12 episodes to a season. I'll give you another example, not that it's to be confused with something like Spy Smasher, but the show Billions, which is the Showtime show about rapacious entrepreneurs. Each series is 12 episodes, and each one, while it has the same basic lineup of characters, they have a separate plot, or let's say a separate situation that has to be resolved by the end of the season. And in the 12 episodes, each episode moves the plot a little further. And while they don't have cliffhanger endings to the extent of having somebody tied to a buzzsaw, the true purpose of the cliffhanger ending was not just to shock somebody with the perilous, life-threatening situation. The point of the cliffhanger was to bring you back. It was to have a note of suspense that would end the show, that would make you say, oh, I got to see that next week. And these TV shows, and Billions is one of them, they do that same thing. They move the plot forward, but they end on a note where something else is going to happen next week that makes you absolutely want to see it. One of my favorites was also a Showtime show called Dexter, which was about a serial killer who tracked down serial killers. Well, every season was a serial. And I forget if it was 10 or 12 episodes, but he would be tracking down a different killer or a different villain in every season. And in the last episode, he'd catch up with him and dispatch him in his own unique way.
Yeah, Bosch is kind of similar to that, although that's based on a series of novels as well. So I guess each season is adapting a novel, but in the serial format. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's so much material here that it's vast, and there's a lot more valuable information contained in your books that people will be able to find links to purchase on the bookshelf page of the podcast website. And now we come to the final question, which is the standard one I ask all my guests. So, Ed, what is your most memorable movie-going experience?
Oh, boy. You know what I think it probably is? I'd like to say it was some vintage movie because I love vintage movies so much. I and another film buff friend happened to be in Hollywood in 1977 for a film fan convention that was taking place at the Sheraton Universal Hotel, which of course is in the San Fernando Valley, just over the hill from Hollywood. So the day before the convention, or I guess it was the day the convention was supposed to begin, we said, we're here in Hollywood. It was the first time for either of us. I said, we got to go down and do the Hollywood Boulevard thing. And we decided as movie buffs that one of the things we'd have to do is see a movie at Grauman's Chinese Theater, whatever it was. So we went in and we got there around, I don't know, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. We walked around. So we see, let's see what time the first show begins. So we go in and there's a movie that's going to start, I don't know, 10 or 10:30. So I said, well, I don't know anything about this. Do you? My friend said, no. He says, but why not? Look, science fictionish. Let's go see it. So we walked around for a half hour or so and then came back, bought our tickets. Nobody online. And we went in and it was Star Wars.
I was wondering if you were leading up to Star Wars. Obviously, it had opened a bit previous to that or something. I can't imagine.
Nope. It was the first show, first day.
Really?
No lines. However, because Hollywood is an industry town, there were people, I would say there were maybe 200 or 300 people in the theater. But when Darth Vader made his first appearance a few minutes into the movie, a bunch of them clapped. So clearly there were industry people in there who knew something about the movie.
Wow.
And of course, I immediately recognized all the serial influences and all the Pulp Fiction influences. So I just loved it. After we did the convention, went back to New Jersey. I saw Star Wars another 5 or 6 times with various groups of friends that I said, hey, you got to see this. You got to see this.
Yeah.
So that was it.
My first time going to Hollywood was in November of 77. And I did the same thing. I went down to Grauman's to because I wanted to see a movie there, and they were running Star Wars in 70 millimeter. And I went in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, and I was the only one in there. So it was like I had my private screening at Grauman's Chinese.
Wow.
I didn't make my first trip there until I think it was February of 82. And of course, I had to go see a movie at Grauman's. Mine wasn't as much fun. They were showing Reds. But but I did also go down the street to the Egyptian Theater, which I was actually more impressed with the interior of that than the Chinese. The movie showing there was Taps, and I went in there. It was an afternoon, and this group of girls came in. And I got the sense that this was like their regular thing to do after they got out of school, was to come see Taps and ogle Tim Hutton and Sean Penn and Tom Cruise and all those guys.
By the way, the Egyptian reopened today.
Oh, it did?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I saw that it was being restored, which I was glad, because when I went there a number of years later, it was my first time seeing that they had remodeled it and cut back and hidden some of the decor and things like that. I was really disappointed. So I was very happy to see that it's been restored. Well, in any case, Ed, I appreciate your time and your information about serials. I hope everybody has enjoyed it as well, and will check out your books and look at the films too that you've recommended and we've talked about. So thank you for joining us on Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thanks, Bill. It's been a real pleasure. Great talking to you, and great talking to you, Jim.
Yeah.
Thanks again to those of you who've joined us. I never did finish the rundown of books Ed has written regarding serials, but rather than detail those here, allow me to extend the suspense and direct you to the bookshelf page of the Movie Nights and Matinees website, where you'll see the full complement of Ed's books on the subject that can be ordered through Amazon by clicking on the cover images. On the screening room page, you'll find links for ordering many cliffhanger serials, including several that we've discussed in this episode. Now, this is where I usually ask you to leave a rating and, if possible, a review wherever you listen to the podcast. It's also where I invite you to submit questions or feedback, either through the comments page on the website or else on the Movie Nights and Matinees Facebook page. But this time I'm not going to do that. Oh, who am I kidding? Of course I want to ask you to do those things. Seriously, people, I really, really, really want to hear from you. What do you like about the podcast? How do you think it compares to other movie-oriented podcasts? What topics would you like to have us cover? Who do you like in the third at Santa Anita? Sorry, my mind may have wandered a bit there. Anyhow, although a couple of you have left some very nice comments, while I know I haven't drawn a huge audience yet, there is still more than enough of you that I'd like to learn more about you and what prompts you to listen. In any case, stay tuned.
And in the next episode, you will see...
Hey, you want to make a movie?
No.